Hi everyone, I'm Jack Lowe, a third year PhD student at Royal Holloway. Today I'm going to talk about making digital games as a research method in geography. I'm going to delve into what this creative process involves and explain what it can offer for geographical knowledge that existing research on digital games in our discipline is lacking. I'm also going to outline some considerations around expertise, ethics, and data collection, showing how a more iterative, experimental approach can help us rethink how we arrive at digital geographical knowledge and the contextual factors that shape it. In terms of methodology, most existing studies of digital games in geography fall into three broad categories. Firstly, ethnographic observations and interviews relating to the play experience. Secondly, content and discourse analysis of games as representations. And finally, charting the economic networks supporting game production and consumption. Yet there's been minimal engagement with the process of how these games are actually made, and I've suggested a few reasons why on this slide. One exception is James Ash's research on video game testing, but even this only delves into that one stage of the game development process. Everything I'm talking about today is based on my PhD research, during which I've developed 3 location-based games myself in my home area of East Kent. Location-based games are a type of digital game where locating, moving through, or interacting with physical space is central to how the play progresses. This research is exploring the connection between location-based games and place, specifically how the design and play of location-based games might enable us to engage with the processes through which places become meaningful to us. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on the development of Canterbury in 3 words, a location-based game that I developed and ran independently between September 2019 and September 2020. This game uses the What 3 Words geolocation system, which divides the world into 3 meters squared and gives each one a unique 3-word address. What 3 Words is marketed as the easiest way to find and share exact locations, but what I was interested in exploring is the meaning-making process when these address words become associated with particular sites. I also questioned whether making locations easy to find actually helps us understand what makes them meaningful as places. Instead, I sought to develop a game that playfully reconfigured What 3 Words as a site-specific storytelling tool. So Canterbury in 3 words involves sharing stories about places in Canterbury using all 3 words of their addresses on What 3 Words, as well as a photograph clue. Other players can then attempt to find the locations using this information and the What 3 Words app. The stories are posted on a private Facebook group, with players commenting on the posts when they find the correct 3-word address used in the story. If you want to learn more about what I found from this project in relation to place and mapping stories, you can read the paper I've linked here that I wrote for the Living Maps review earlier this year. For the rest of this presentation though, I'm going to focus on what I learned from the practice-based methodology of developing this game and the implications of these findings for how we study the geographies of digital games and digital media more broadly. So first, I'm going to talk about the game's development as a distinctly iterative design process. So developing a game isn't a straightforward linear trajectory from a design problem to a solution. Yet in the humanities, there's a tendency to talk about design intentions in quite unified terms, what kinds of politics are being represented or how design techniques achieve affective outcomes. What I want to demonstrate is that there's a high degree of uncertainty and mess involved in this design process. Importantly, a game's development is rarely the product of an individual designer's ideas and practices. Whether or not a project is explicitly collaborative, an individual designer will typically need to engage with other people with varying motivations, ideas, commitments, and resources somewhere along the line. Indeed, even though Canterbury in 3 words was actually devised solely by me, I found that the complex relationships I had with other individuals and organizations leading up to the game's public release had tangible impacts on the eventual form that it took. So, for example, at one stage, I was aiming to work with several local community groups to widen the accessibility of the game to marginalized populations. However, particularly during the pandemic, the responses I received were highly variable despite my long-established community connections in Canterbury. At one point, I even made a strong contact with a coordinator at a local arts organisation, discussing the possibility of running Canterbury in 3 words storytelling workshops with disadvantaged community members, for whom the game would otherwise be inaccessible. However, after a promising initial dialogue, several further emails received no response, meaning that this idea had to be abandoned. And this is just one illustration of how the directions a game's design takes can be heavily influenced by the wider contextual factors that are difficult to control, predict, and make sense of. As the game's design develops further and was ready to be tested by players, I encountered another element of uncertainty in working with player feedback. In many cases, I found player responses to different features of the game to be highly ambivalent, making it difficult to decide on the most appropriate way to move forward with the design. Often I had to try to make multiple approaches to tackling a design challenge before players responded in a way that was meaningful for my research questions and that I could address practically. Furthermore, testing regularly threw up unexpected outcomes that significantly altered the course of how the game developed. During the initial test of Canterbury in 3 words in the months prior to the pandemic, some players described how, because of the poor weather and their limited time to play in Canterbury, they decided to perform all the game actions solely using online technologies such as Google Street View. They went on to describe how much more accessible the game became as a result. And this observation meant that when the initial COVID-19 lockdown unfolded in 2020, I knew I'd be able to adapt the gameplay to become online only. Altering the game functions to enable participation via Street View meant people could still play the game responsibly, while also enabling those who didn't live in Canterbury to participate. So what we can see then is that developing a game from initial concept to testing to public release isn't a coherent linear process. Being a designer here was more about finding different ways to frame problems rather than solving them outright. It was about relying on a range of actors with incomplete information and competing commitments to negotiate. So as we've seen so far, much of Canterbury in 3 words development involved quite logistical, almost managerial decisions. Yet when people think about what expertise is needed to design games, there's always the assumption that it would involve computer programming. However, in most cases, the experiences of designers and players aren't perceived in terms of code. More important are the affordances of a game's design that determine which kinds of interaction are possible and how these can be achieved, not necessarily involving code. So the organization of Canterbury in 3 words interface is a good example of this. I needed to provide an online platform I could administrate for players to share and discuss their stories of places in Canterbury. Here, the example I turned to was the Painted Rocks game, which is played by millions of people in local communities worldwide using Facebook groups. Players hide rocks that they paint themselves in public places, and then other players post photographs with them on the groups to show when they've been found and re-hidden. So what was evident about this game is how embedded it is in the everyday life of local communities. It relies both on people coming across the rocks during their everyday activities and when doing their daily browsing on Facebook. This ultimately led me to use a private Facebook group for Canterbury in 3 words as a means of integrating the game's development into the everyday lives of diverse people in the city. I may not have programmed the software myself, but I adapted it to my needs, and ultimately it provided the affordances for the kinds of interaction that I envisaged. Of course, regardless of expertise, there's always the incentive to want to make a game that engages people. And while there might not be the same financial and reputational imperatives compared to working with games companies, you have to consider the reputation and resources of anyone you're collaborating with, as well as your own. That said, it's true that designing games for within a research framework can give you a license for experimentation that might not be feasible in commercial settings. One area where experimentation can be more challenging is in research ethics. So when the kinds of gameplay interactions that you're facilitating change with each new iteration of the game's design, it can mean that the goalposts are constantly shifting in terms of what's needed for participation to be ethical. However, as we all know, institutional ethics procedures tend not to give much room for flexibility. So with Canterbury in 3 words, I managed this in 2 main ways. Firstly, when submitting my initial ethics assessment, I indicated that some details may need to be updated as the fieldwork progressed. When this happened, I resubmitted my ethics assessment as far in advance of any changes to the game as possible. However, sometimes situations can arise where you need to make decisions that weren't anticipated when you did the initial assessment. And when these issues arose, I addressed my responsibilities by continually reflecting in my research diary on how I could best avoid harm. So rather than seeing these ethical conundrums as a negative thing, iterative practice-based approaches to fieldwork can be an opportunity to approach ethics less as a rigid framework and more as a responsibility to continually reconsider how harm can be avoided in our research practices. So lastly, I want to talk about data collection. So all these design processes of planning, testing, editing, and so on present an interesting challenge for gathering research data as you're studying your own behavior, decisions, and situations as a designer, as much as others you're working with or people who are playing your games. So one of the main questions is how to record the less tangible or ephemeral aspects of the creative process. Within game design, depending on your role, this might mean retaining all creative documents such as design notes, sketches, maps, concept art, and so on. And keeping a dated record of all this over time can help to illustrate the diverse contextual factors that come to shape the eventual design of a game. However, it can be difficult to find ways to present this material meaningfully in research outputs, as what you're showing can appear very incoherent without detailed explanation. It then also becomes hard to let these creative moments speak for themselves rather than drawing them into a wider narrative. So in my case, every day I undertook design work, I reflected on my experiences in a research diary. And then when looking back through the data, this reminded me where my headspace was at the time when other contextual factors were unfolding. And this helped me to kind of see it as a design process rather than just through the lens of the finished game. When it comes to player experiences, it's very difficult to observe and record all player interactions, especially for a location-based game which is played in diverse physical settings. For Canterbury in 3 words, I could observe the online traces of player activities in content posted to the Facebook group. Nonetheless, interviews were still a really effective method for getting a sense of players' motivations and feelings when playing a game. I typically bring up content from the Facebook group to look at with the interviewees to get a sense of how they perceived these online traces of the gameplay. For those who weren't willing to be interviewed, anonymous feedback forms and polls within the game itself were sometimes effective, but it was especially hard to access the motivations of players who weren't engaging in the game for whatever reason. So this says something about the lack of disclosure behind data gathered solely through digital settings. So while digital activity can generate a lot of data, it can be more difficult to understand the context behind that data compared to more typical ethnographic scenarios where you're observing and talking to people in situ. So if there's one thing that's particularly innovative about my approach to data collection, it was probably the importance of triangulating between many different sources of data. So doing this reveals something about the context-specific, messy, and contingent factors that shape digital game development and practices involving digital technologies more broadly. To conclude then, what I hope to have demonstrated is something of the dynamism, uncertainty, and messiness of game development. While geographers have tended to portray game development as quite a coherent process, taking part in game design as research can reveal the array of contextual factors involved, the incompleteness of information that informs design decisions, and the experimentation necessary to find new ways to address design challenges. What I'm arguing is that we can translate this iterative approach to our research with other kinds of digital media. The notion of working with the digital as involving expertise and being innovative actually masks a lot of the everyday non-expert practices through which digital technologies have geographical implications. I'd argue that being innovative in this context actually demands a fuller awareness of the contexts in which digital media are produced and interacted with. It involves triangulating between these different contexts to both gather meaningful data and to behave ethically as researchers. And it involves going beyond rigid institutional and epistemological frameworks and instead speaking to all the moments that space is implicated in living with digital media. Thank you.